So welcome everyone to our webinar today on improving your board's decision-making in 2025. And now I want to introduce you to all of our presenters for today. So we have with us today Hilda Polenko, who is Marketing Managing Principal at BDO, Peter Frosted, founder of Nonprofit Financial Acumen, Nancy Bacon, co-founder of Nonprofit Learning Center, and our own Dana Brito, who is a NFC moderator and founding principal at Cultivar Consulting, and of course, Ruth McCambridge, the director of content at Nonprofit Financial Commons. And we also have our moderators with us today. We have Wade Rogers, who is going to be moderating the chat along with Mark Hager. So any questions that you have throughout the webinar today, please feel free to enter them in the chat at any point during the webinar. And then Wade and Mark will bring those to the presenters during our Q&A section. But also feel free to answer questions from your fellow participants in the chat as well and add information there. But we do have a few ground rules for the chat. Please do not make any sales in the chat and don't add any services that you might provide in the chat. We want to be respectful of everyone that is on the webinar, so please don't do that. And also, the information that is being presented on our webinar, we want to make sure that we are respecting the content that is being provided by our presenters. So if you would like to utilize or share any of this information, please feel free to contact me at anelson@nonprofitfinancials.org. And before we jump into the webinar, I just have something important to share. So you're here because you care about doing your work better, serving your mission more effectively, and staying ahead of a very fast changing nonprofit landscape. And that's exactly why NFC exists. This webinar, like everything we do, is built to give you the practical real-world knowledge and support that helps nonprofit professionals like you thrive. But here's the thing. We're not backed by a big institution or endless foundation dollars. We're funded by people like you, those who use and benefit from our work. So if you believe in free, high-quality trainings like this being available to nonprofits of all sizes, a donation of any size makes a really big difference. It allows us to keep showing up for this community with resources that are smart, relevant, and rooted in what nonprofits actually face every day. So if you can, I'm asking you to chip in with a donation today. You'll find a link in the chat now and at the end of the webinar. And if you've already donated, thank you, because you've truly powered the work that we do. So now I'm going to hand over to Ruth to interview our case study.
Thank you. Before we cut to the case study, I want to just quickly say what this session is about, frame it a little bit. And I want to think back to a article that was written years ago by William Ryan, which was called Problem Boards or Board Problem. And essentially what he was saying is that our expectations of boards are sometimes pretty unrealistic. And they basically cause problems in the boardroom because we don't really organize ourselves around the way boards and staffs actually work together in their best case scenarios. So I wanted to read you just one little paragraph from that. he writes, how can we be sure that an operational matter is not of sufficient significance to warrant the board's attention? It doesn't help to assert that the governor should not manage when the difference between management and governance is not all that crystal clear. It's also hard to govern at arm's length from the organization and without firsthand knowledge of the business. How can a board develop strategy without direct contact with operational realities of the organization, which is precisely where new strategies and ideas often emerge and invariably are validated or discredited? How can a board really evaluate the performance of an organization without direct knowledge of the enterprise? And this is exactly what we're going to talk about today, because what we're going to talk about is the relationship between the staff and the staff's role in really guiding the work of the board when they're making financial decisions. It doesn't help, as he points out in this wonderful article, which you can go back and read at NPQ if you want to. He points out that boards often act pretty episodically. They may fall asleep for months at a time, and then when something urgent emerges, they suddenly know that they have to, kind of ride into the fray. And they may not feel completely settled to do that, but they know that they have a responsibility. There's a million issues involved with this kind of natural tension that exists between the board and the staff. But a lot of us do manage to figure out, okay, what do we have to do to ensure that our board is able to make decisions with enough understanding of the operational realities to really act in a kind of a mature and collaborative way with the staff leadership. And so today, that is really what we're talking about. What is that relationship? What does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it entail? And so we're going to start off this session with an interview with Nancy Frugo. And I don't know if you can get Nancy up on the screen. Thank you. Who is with the Clove Alliance. And Nancy's going to tell us a little bit. I call the role that she takes the financial brains. It doesn't mean that she's all of the financial brains on staff, but she is a significant part of it, and the part that really understands how all of the details are involved with the bigger picture, basically. So Nancy, welcome.
Thank you.
And maybe we could start by you just talking a little bit about what the Clove Alliance is, how big it is, and what its revenue mix is.
Well, I'm Nancy Frazier. I'm CFO of Clove Alliance, which is a small nonprofit in Illinois that is a rape crisis center. So we have a variety of funding. Our current budget is $1.5 million, and we support 20 staff. And being a rape crisis center, because we don't have a shelter or anything, that's almost all staff is our budget. And we currently have one main funding stream, which is ICASA, which is Illinois Coalition Against Sexual Assault. That's the lion's share of our money, and it's a mix of federal and state funds. And then we have additional funds from the state that are also flow through. One's through the Attorney General and one through the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority. And then we have some really tiny ones that are like United Way and some local foundation grants.
So I know where you're located, which is in Illinois, which is actually a state which vies for first or second place in being late on its payables, depending on when you look at it. Illinois it has been famously late on paying its contracts. It's gotten better over the last few years, I think. But can you talk a little bit about what the impact of that has on your management?
Well, definitely cash flows are the do-all, end-all. I need to know roughly who's going to pay and at what time, and I put them into a spreadsheet, which, because we all know that your like QuickBooks does not do an effective cash flow. And it gives me an idea of what's coming from where. Now, the only fortunate thing about Illinois Coalition Against Sexual Assault being our lead entity is that it's for 29 rape crisis centers and it's getting a big pot of money. So they have a lot more influence to go to the comptroller, to go to the legislators and say, okay, you can't keep holding the funds. You know, agencies are just floating too much money to survive. But I have to say, our smaller ones, and smaller being like 150 to 100, well, 200,000 now, of our smaller funds, yeah, that is a real struggle for us. And it is constantly, I hate to say nagging, but asking, hey, so when are funds coming? Because those only pay every 3 months. So we've been in excess of 6 months getting those payments, which can really hurt the cash flow.
I want everyone to hear that. She said 6 months.
Mhm.
So can you talk about, you do have a line of credit which has to be managed. Can you talk about how big that line of credit is?
Currently, it's $201,000. Why the one, I don't know. The bank decided that. And it is vital to us. At one point, actually, during the pandemic, we got a PPP loan because we also had an increase in funding. So we actually got a PPP loan for about $215,000. So more or less, our line of credit now replaces the PPP loan as it's gone. But we can be floating generally when the contracts are new, July 1st, and they haven't quite figured out how to fund for the next year. Our wait can be end of September, middle of October. So I've floated in excess of $450,000 before, which is roughly a third of our budget. So if it was not for that line of credit, we could not do it. We would be, I don't know if we'd be to the point of laying off people, but I would definitely be calling all my vendors and saying, okay, hold it, we're going to be late.
Yeah. And the reality is, because most of your budget is personnel,
Mhm.
you've got to make those payrolls.
Yes.
And so there's no question that you kind of have to pay your bills
Mhm.
or most of your bills on time. That doesn't necessarily mean that the state has any empathy for that or or ability to kind of make any arrangements for you.
Correct.
So all of that provides a fairly tight management scenario for you. And
Mhm.
it requires, I think, for your board to really understand what it is that you're facing. And what they have to be aware of, because there are certain things that you have to keep an eye on
Mhm.
in order to be able to function. Could you talk a little bit about what you kind of constantly keep an eye on?
Cash flow is the most important thing, followed by where my reimbursements are. And like I said, I actually budget out like month by month for the whole year because there are some things that are cyclical and only happen once a year or every quarter. And we have, as an agency, started probably even before the pandemic. We look at our board members and look at what's strategic, because since we do more or less kind of pick our own board members, we can look and see what the strengths and weaknesses are. So we can go and look and say, okay, we don't have anybody that has any real medical experience, which when you're a crisis center, it's kind of nice to have someone that would have that experience. Or, we need someone with some HR experience because we're experiencing some questions. So we do go out and actually look for people that would understand, even if they don't necessarily work with the state, that perhaps they have a reimbursement background. So we've had people that have come from probation, which of course is a county function. They do grants, so their reimbursement's a little different, but they grasped it. We actually had a CPA, which was fantastic. She understood it kind of, but she adapted to it easily because she was a CPA. And this round, we've got, I don't know what to say. She works for Farm Bureau is the best way to put it. So they're getting payments, but they're also getting federal money. So she understands that whole ebb and flow of, you have like $1,000 in the checking account and everything's coming due and you have to pay everybody. And then next week, suddenly you have $250,000. And it's like,
Right.
wow, okay. Yay, great. Let's pay all our bills. So
Right.
that is extremely beneficial to have at least a couple of people on the board that grasp that, and especially so they can go into that treasurer role, because then they can kind of be the interpreter. Is that the best way to put it? That they,
Your treasurer is actually very familiar with reimbursement
Yes.
processes, right?
Mhm.
So that because it's so primary in your business model, which it is, it
Mhm.
always probably will be, as long as you're there, having a treasurer who can mm, kind of constantly translate that for people who are not
Mhm.
so used to what that means in terms of management requirements is incredibly important. Can you talk a little bit about the process that you go to kind of move financial information from yourself to the board? In basically, who do you talk to, and who do you have to keep briefed, and how does that kind of information flow work?
Well, obviously, the CEO of the agency and I are practically meeting at least once a week, if not more often, saying, okay, where are we at? Who's paid? Who hasn't paid? What bills are coming up? But that also being said, that if things are not going like with the normal sort of function, we have a hiccup that something's not paid, or we suddenly got an influx of payments, we actually communicate that with our executive board. We might just simply shoot them an email and say, hey, this particular funder is currently 6 months behind. We are actually talking to them and like the people above them to try to see how to get this going again. So that is an important concept of it. But then again, they're also the ones deciding what sort of materials we need to present to the whole board, because they don't need to know, like I used to say, they don't need to know every time you buy a roll of toilet paper, but they do need to know like what your expenses are in a general sense. So I've learned that instead of completely inundating them with charts and figures, I have one dashboard, and on that dashboard for myself, for the fiscal part, I express income and show it compared to the previous year, and I show expenses and compare it to the previous year, and then give my cash flow projections, which 30 days is pretty good, 60 days isn't bad, 90 days is usually fantasy land because I never know when anyone's going to pay me. But it has worked out really well. And then anything that's I need to mention, like someone's 6 months behind, or we're anticipating this being paid this month, or we got an advance, which ironically we did get that from Illinois. I don't know how we managed that, but we got an advance. So I will mention those usually to executive board, specifically the treasurer, and then that will become part of the meeting minutes when we have the board meeting, so that can be expressed. And if anyone has questions, they'll ask them because I'm at the board meeting too.
Well, Nancy, thank you for explaining all this. This interview was meant really to illustrate the degree of skill we bring to managing and communicating about the finances in even relatively modest-sized organizations. It can be incredibly complex, and so in some ways, the Nonprofit Financial Commons is dedicated overall to everybody who works in these positions inside of nonprofits, whether you're an executive director or wherever you are in the staff of nonprofits, where you're actually almost the financial brains of the operation. At least the part of the brain that's communicating the immediate needs and flows of the organization. So thank you so much, Nancy. And I do want to say Nancy is a member of our community and was coming to this webinar anyway. So we grabbed her and put her on screen. Thank you very much. And I'm going to hand this over to Dana.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ruth. Hello, everyone. Welcome. So happy to be here with you all, and thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. Again, as Amanda mentioned, my name is Dana Brito. So I'm both a moderator for the Nonprofit Financial Commons team, and I also do individual consulting and financial management consulting for nonprofits across the country. And so I think sort of building off of that wonderful interview with Nancy, and I think, again, Ruth really set the stage and I think really grounded us in thinking about what are expectations and more specifically, what are realistic expectations from board members, particularly in times of uncertainty and risk. And I think in thinking about those expectations, I think it's important to really ground us in thinking about what financial leadership is and what it entails. And so when I'm talking about financial leadership, I'm talking about guiding your organization to maximum mission impact while ensuring financial sustainability. And for those of you who had tuned into another webinar we did around boards last year, we really spent a lot of time really distinguishing this type of financial leadership from financial management. So basically, the execution and oversight of fiscal transactions, the execution of fiscal policies and procedures, generating the reports. So, but financial leadership, we're really talking again around ensuring mission impact and financial sustainability and doing it within your unique operating and mission delivery contexts. And so I think again, wanting to highlight from Nancy's story again, really commend her and her team for being very intentional around seeking the specific expertise that are most critical to organizations with her financial situation and looking at, given their dependence on government contracts, thinking about people who have expertise with the ebbs and flows that come with those specific business models. But I also think it's worth mentioning and highlighting the fact that, yes, while you should seek that expertise on a board level when and where you have the opportunity to do so, it's also important not to underestimate the financial leadership that exists even outside of the board, particularly at a staff level. And this, again, it can exist in the context of your finance lead, but it also can exist in the context of even your program directors who are very well versed in the fact that if we don't achieve these, service delivery targets, we won't get paid, especially in a reimbursement model. So I think I think for those of us who are not finance people, I am not a CPA. I don't have an accounting or a finance degree, so I learned everything I learned in my 18 plus years working with and for nonprofits in the finance and operations end. I think it's really important not to underestimate for those of you who have been in your jobs for at least a little while, there's some real leadership and really important perspectives that you're bringing into the financial leadership conversation and muscle building with your organizations and really not to underestimate that. And I think even those of us who have board members who may be quote unquote finance people or who work, in investment banking or real estate or what have you, there's as I think many of you may know, there's really very unique aspects to nonprofit finance that just don't translate to for-profit finance. And so I think in many cases, there's leadership and there's knowledge that very much exists and is led by the staff level, and that leadership is required to really help bring the board along um, and provide educations and insights that they may not often have in their own unique individual and professional backgrounds, and really not taking that for granted. And I understand, especially for those of us who are wearing, you know 12 different hats at our organizations, it can feel like another job to train the board, but it's really just a proactive and strategic effort to bring them alongside with you and produce and really help generate the type of thought partnership that will really help support you in the long run. Next slide, please. So I think in leading up to this webinar, we got understandably a lot of questions around how do we best focus the board, what information should they see, where do we really prioritize in our financial discussions, in our reporting with the board. And I think at its core, it really does rely on and depend on a keen focus and understanding of what your organization's unique business model is. The Commons has done individual webinars on each of these types of business models that you're seeing here. And again, when I'm saying business model, I'm talking about what is the primary revenue type or driver for your organization and what are the characteristics and risks that come with that. So for those of you who are interested in learning more, please access our site to learn about and learn a little bit more about how to think about the opportunities, challenges, and risks tied to each of these business models. But I think again, as Nancy's story indicated, a business model that's predominantly dependent on government funding certainly has very real risks around cash flow, right? She mentioned like 6 months late, or historically, or up to 6 months late, having to flow at one point, up to a third of her operating budget before seeing those reimbursements. The absolute necessity of a line of credit, and I think for those of you who manage government funding, all of those items in those storylines will probably resonate. But even if you're an organization that's predominantly funded by individual donors, that comes with its own unique needs, risks, capacity requirements, capital needs. So, I think, for example, you again really need to be able to drive those relationships. May need software like a strong client relation management software or CRM to track donations. The information that you are looking at might vary in terms of donor retention, number of new donors, what have you. So I think it really starts in being very clear and intentional across your staff, but certainly with your board. What is our business model, and what are the unique needs and risks that our business model will bring us, depending on what our primary revenue source is. Slide. So in terms of just, I think, best priming the board, and we'll talk a lot about this. I think Nancy Bacon and Peter Farstad will have a lot of helpful tips and also tools for this. But really, again, not underestimating the need for training and training on, I think, not just a one-time thing, but also regularly building that muscle and that strategic financial leadership um, capacity over time. So really, again, thinking about having conversations with board members. If you are able to secure some type of resource for external training on nonprofit finance, do it. But really, again, training on these are our key formulas. These are the patterns of our cash flow. These are the key performance indicators that are most critical to our financial health and sustainability. And again, making sure you're regularly presenting that information, talking about it, and educating board members on it in a very intentional and repeatable way. I think it also is really important to be really thoughtful and strategic about the financial information that you're sharing and how you're presenting it. So I think, as particularly for board members who are not treasurers or finance people, very often eyes will glaze over if you just print out a 3-page profit and loss statement right from QuickBooks, or a 100-line balance sheet from the financial accounting system. So be really and it really expecting, especially non-finance people or people who aren't comfortable with finance, to engage in that type of information in a very meaningful way that helps facilitate decision making is a tall and probably unrealistic ask. So Nancy mentioned a tool, dashboards. We did a whole webinar on that last year. So being really thoughtful about, based on our business model, these are the indicators that we need to track. Being really thoughtful about the benchmarks that you're using to evaluate and measure success, and doing it in a way that's digestible and understandable across varying levels of financial expertise or sophistication. Being really intentional too about the story that you're telling behind the numbers. And I think this is where I think staff become really critical. And even if they're not necessarily at the board meeting presenting, making sure that staff perspectives, from a program perspective, from a fundraising perspective, from an operations management perspective, that you're really having a broad range of perspectives tell the story behind the numbers, to make sure that you're understanding really what's undergirding them and what is driving the results that you're seeing. And I think finally, it's, again, I think for those of us who are not MBAs, or who didn't start off as finance experts, it can feel really daunting, and there's almost an inclination to want to defer to the finance expert and to the person who is your quote unquote numbers person. But again, like I said before, really don't underestimate your own knowledge and leadership in the finance area, and your own ability to determine the ebbs and flows, the formulas, and the key drivers of your business. and also work towards building broader understanding beyond just your key finance person. And again, that key finance person, as in Nancy's case did, can help sort of be an ambassador and a trainer for other board members, and also again making sure you're leveraging those opportunities to do so. But again, it's all about building, as to the greatest extent possible, broader leadership beyond just one person on the board, and using those financial experts that you do have on the board to share the knowledge and bring more people in to facilitate more effective and broader and effective financial decision making. So with that, I will, we have, before we move on, we do have, and really want to get a sense of this concept of financial leadership and how it is or isn't showing up in your organization. So we have two polls. The first one being overall, based on that definition of financial leadership, where does financial leadership come from in your organizations? And we have a few options: board treasurer, full board of directors, executive leadership staff, other management staff, other staff, and or volunteers. So take a moment, and once we have a fairly good representation of responses, we'll share. So take a couple more seconds if you haven't already submitted.
We'll give a few more seconds and then I'll.
Yeah. And I'm interested in how people are answering this, or how difficult it is to answer. Let's see the results. All right, so overwhelmingly with 69%, it feels like, at least amongst this group, that financial leadership is coming from executive leadership staff. I get not entirely surprising. I think, especially based on some of the conversations that we've had, even up to this point in today's presentation. And again, I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's, again, how do you, within your capacity and within your roles, help broaden and bring the board more fully into that financial leadership. And again, being really intentional about the tools and the data that you're doing to facilitate that process. And so we have one more poll. Rate your board leadership on financial literacy as it is needed to remain alert and responsive to our current environment. So are you worried about their level of financial literacy? Do they seem okay with some level of staff guidance? Or are they, thinking about the experts on Nancy board, do they know the variables and have an intimate knowledge based on their own lived experiences, both within and outside of your organization? So pick which one you think qualifies in terms of your board's financial literacy.
This one may take a little longer for people to answer, so we can give them a few more seconds.
Sure thing. Yeah, and you do have to rank the orders, which makes it a little less quick.
Okay.
Look at that. All right. So in terms of board leadership on financial literacy, a big portion actually has expressed some concerns and worry. And then I think there's quite a few also that I think, again, potentially know the variables. And I think, again, this is going to vary depending on who you have on your board, your business model, what you're dealing with. But I think particularly for those who do worry, I hope you use today as an opportunity, again, to reflect on, I think, the extent to which you actually possess a fair amount of financial leadership, but also take advantage of some of the tips and tools that we'll be talking about today, and really in generating that education and that knowledge, but also maintaining that level of focus that's so important, particularly in times of uncertainty, crisis, and enhanced risk. So with that, I will hand it off to Hilda.
Thank you, Dana, and thank you everyone for joining. Hilda Polanco. I lead a team at BDO that focuses on working with nonprofit leaders, and this is one of our favorite topics of conversation. I must say, Dana, when you were talking about the financial expert on the board that people might tend to rely on, I certainly feel that's a lonely place to be when I find myself on boards, and building the skills of the whole board is really what we want to be working on. Dana mentioned several points that I think I want to start with as I lead into my section of the program. And that is really to think about how we bring leaders together, the leadership that Dana described, which is the combination of the leadership staff and the board around understanding the financial implications for the organization. We are in quite an uncertain time right now with lots of uncertainty for organizations. And as we've been speaking to leaders and board members, we realize that understanding the risk that the organization may be facing in these uncertain times is really a top priority. And the staff, as you saw in the previous survey, staff is often the closest to the knowledge of what is happening and what the implications might be. Having said that, with the uncertainty and almost like the significance of the uncertainty, questions that are coming up for organizations are really significant in nature. And so, this idea that the board is really the governing body and any strategic decisions really need to be led by and supported by the board, we ask ourselves, how can we bring leaders together to really assess the level of risk that an organization may have? And we can assess risk in many different ways. Today, we're focusing on a financial perspective. So, my observations about risk assessment in the few moments here is around revenue risk and understanding what are the possible outcomes in the uncertainty of your revenues, and where might that position the organization? When we work with funders, they understand that not all nonprofit grantees are facing the same level of risk. When we work with individual leaders, we try and emphasize this idea that it's very personal to the organization, very much about where this organization is. So, using this tool that I'm going to walk through, and thinking about how your organization may get to a conclusion, and I will orient you to three levels of potential risk condition that an organization may find itself in, that we have found to be a good starting point. Think of it as a gut check. This is not about perfection, answering every question that you possibly might have, but it's directional. It is, how are we feeling about the implications of the revenue possibilities for the organization? And each of these levels of risk might indicate a few actions where the board and leadership may start to collaborate around some of the decisions that might be warranted. So after going through perhaps some scenario planning or some general conversation about impact, we have seen that organizations fall into one of three levels of risk. And the first level of risk is what we call minimal expected impact. And I urge you, as I walk through my three levels of risk here, to be thinking about your organization and where you might be with respect to the conditions that are real for you and the changes that you're expecting in revenue. So for some of you, you may find that you are in this minimal expected impact. The changes that you're expecting to your program and your revenue are not significant. There may be some minor decreases in funding, but overall, the revenue sources might be increasing or basically staying neutral. If you were to find yourself in this minimal expected level, I would suggest that we think about, how do we maintain the programs? Even if at this moment we don't find significant risk, how can we minimize any expenses at the current moment that don't significantly impact mission. I think part of the message here with this analysis is that you may find yourself in one quadrant and then see yourself sort of moving to the right or moving to the left based on what's happening with your revenue. So this is not a one-time analysis, never to be revisited again. I encourage you to keep this as a very real, live analysis, perhaps on a quarterly basis or more often if the revenue shifts happen more often. So minimal expected impact, I would say business as usual, and we want to understand and confirm the metrics that are telling us that and have the board fully understand. Remember that your board members might also sit on other boards, and those other organizations may be a bit further to the right on the risk continuum, and they may be bringing that worry to your organization's financial review. So for yourself, first level, minimal impact. For some organizations, you might find yourself in what we're referring to as significant risk, otherwise requiring business model recalibration. So one way to think about this is based on today's structure for the organization and based on the revenue shifts that we are expecting, we will need to make some significant changes. This may mean one or more programs either shifting or downsizing. It may mean some staff adjustments, infrastructure reductions. How can we identify exactly what the variables are that bring us to this business model recalibration so that we can take steps to manage that risk and make the decisions we need to make to manage the risk today and minimize the risk increasing to what I'll talk about in a little bit is would be the third level. So in this middle level, we are recalibrating our business model. We are thinking about maybe outsourcing certain functions. We're thinking maybe about collaborating with other organizations. I was speaking to one leader recently who said, I'm not affected by federal funding cuts personally, but my program partner organization is. And as a result, a program that we have run together for a period of time we can no longer run, and therefore now I'm impacted. And so there are ripple effects to changes in funding and understanding your direct change impact as well as impact to other parts of the community that are key to your business model. So that is what I would call the mid-level of risk. Think of it as I need to do something differently. And when I say I, there's where the partnership comes in. If you are thinking about recalibrating your business model, Dana spoke about how your business model really is driven by your revenue sources. If you're recalibrating, there are going to be some significant decisions made, and the board needs to be an integral part of it. And no leader on this call should feel that they have to have it all figured out by the time they present it to the board. This is about figuring it out together so that that financial acumen and that financial leadership that we've been speaking about so far really is owned by both the board and staff. And this may mean staff recognizing some of the senior leaders in the organization that it is their program that maybe is shifting. And so these are not easy conversations, but from what I understand in speaking to leaders, they would rather be in the conversation than be wondering outside the conversation what the organization may be thinking about in managing its risk. So again, in this middle level, we're recalibrating, we're thinking about new ways that we may need to run the organization. In this third level of risk, we would consider existentially redefining the organization. With this assessment comes right sizing in a significant way, or maybe considering alternative operating models. This concept of collaborations and backbone organizations and collaboratives and how organizations can come together to deliver a program is a conversation that needs to happen when you feel that you've moved beyond your ability to deliver on your mission in your current structure. This may mean transferring a program from your organization to another, or another organization transferring a program to you, depending on what the variables are. And there are strategies that refer to program asset transfers that really relate to the assets of a program moving from one organization to another, so that you can preserve the legacy of those programs and perhaps preserve intellectual property, or what we would call like the secret sauce that this organization has built. All of these decisions are sustainability of the organization for the purpose of meeting the mission. And in this third quadrant, meeting the mission may mean a different corporate structure. If after looking at many alternatives, perhaps after some transfer of programs, there is some additional thinking that's necessary, things like mergers or fiscal sponsorship as an option, consolidation, which is a different way of thinking of merger, or sunsetting the organization. As you might imagine, these are more complex conversations, but in essence, the takeaway here is that not saying it out loud does not decrease the chances that it may need to be thought through. And so the more you out loud with your board identify, where do we find ourselves and what is our plan, and how can we build the financial updates on a quarterly basis, or more often if you feel you need it, to respond to these assessment points and to give us the data we need, particularly to know what would need to happen for us to move one level to the right. And those are the takeaways that you want to bring into your future board conversations. I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to our Q&A a little bit later today. And so now I am going to pass the baton to our moderators, who are going to help us with the Q&A.
Thank you, Hilda. Thank you for everyone who's spoken so far. We have lots of great questions and quite a mix coming in. So I'm trying to synthesize them the best I can. But speaking where we are right now with respect to having board members essentially kind of trained up in their duties, maybe I'll start with kind of the more basic question in terms of, you know, Dana, you mentioned having ongoing training, just a part of your routine. Any comments on sort of best practices on the timing, the content, and how to address that? And I'm going to go a little deeper in a second once you've answered that in terms of specifics of organizations.
I'm happy to start, but certainly curious
Yeah.
to hear others' points of view here. So I think in terms of training how to do it, types of the cadence, again, I think not to steal too much thunder. I think we'll hear a little bit more about this from Nancy Bacon and Peter Farstad as well. But I do think it's just a matter of, again, understanding where your board is as it relates to their interactions with finance, and being a little intentional and responsive to that, right? I think, again, I would avoid just in, in your standard board packet, just sending a 15-page report. That's not the way to train your staff. I do think it ends up, I think there could be some more time for one-on-one conversations with board members around, and to the extent that they feel comfortable, because again, money can be really hard to talk about for many reasons. But I think it's being honest about and leaving us a safe space for comfort with numbers. But I think it really is a matter of in a very focused way. I think Nancy Fregeau provided a perfect example of this with it, like things like a dashboard is like, this is what absolutely is super critical to us. And even if you can't read a profit and loss statement or can't tell me exactly what a temporary restricted net asset is, or get mystified by this release of restriction line in our reports, ensuring that at least at the minimum baseline knowledge of the biggest drivers that are most critical to your financial success. And again, I think in terms of training, I totally understand organizations that may not have time for, or even resources to bring in an external facilitator or trainer. Still think it's worth the investment, especially if you are dealing, for those of you who had checked off that you are concerned about the financial literacy of your board. I think thinking about external training opportunities should be a priority, but even if that's not an opportunity or a privilege that you have, building, I would just say the best way is building in the repetition and the rhythm of every meeting. We're going to be looking at these things. We're going to be talking about these things in this way. What do people have questions? Do they not? And particularly being really intentional about directing and connecting your board financial expert with those who may feel a little less confident and comfortable with the numbers.
That's such a good point too, because another of the questions in the registration were, how do I keep them engaged going forward? And I think that's a really good point, that this really needs to happen every time the board's together, is that there's something to really spark their interest and increase their knowledge. And so many questions as well. I mean, they run the gamut about board members being manipulative or ignoring me, or in the weeds. And it feels like there's so much kind of angst out there about the board role versus the staff role. And maybe that needs to be part of the board training as well. What is it that you do, and what is it that we do? And how can you help us? One of the comments was, our board wants us to produce these reports and these projections that are way beyond our capacity. And that's a way for the board to support the staff. I hope I'm not going out on a limb with that comment, but I feel like that may be an element of that board training as well. I just wanted to maybe get anybody's feedback on that.
I think it's when I saw that question, I was just like, the board needs to be financially expert enough to know what's possible to be done by the staff.
Yeah.
And the staff needs to understand what the board is feeling anxious about and how they can answer that maybe in a different way that doesn't eat up all of the staff time. So it's just, sometimes it's very hard to get caught in a dance with the board instead of really engaging around what actually do you need to know to be able to move forward. And I think that sometimes the faulty view of, well, the board is this and the staff is that, it creates an inability to actually collaborate around what information is necessary and how you need to talk about it in a way that's respectful to both sides. So I do think, people tend to feel like, well, my board is problematic. All boards are problematic. Because we have like a kind of outlandish view of the way that they are going to function. They are a set of tensions that we have to manage all of the time in terms of who knows what and who's making what decisions and all of that. But it's healthy, and if we manage it right.
Thanks, Ruth. And one more thing, I know we have to get back to our agenda. Sandy posted in the chat something that we often forget about, are the different types of structures. And the question is, what if you don't have staff? So we're dealing in this case with a volunteer organization run by the board, in fact. So this would have to be scalable to a different scenario. In the few seconds, does anybody have any comment there on how this might translate to an all-volunteer organization?
Yeah, I think it's I think this tension or the dynamic of the role between the staff and the board is interesting. I'm glad it was called out as something that I think requires, again, financial leadership requires understanding what is doable by staff and not staff. But I think in the case of a volunteer-led organization, I also think we need to understand that roles of boards may need to change and evolve with the change of an organization, or depending on where the organization is in their organizational life cycle, right? So if you are an entirely volunteer-run organization, or at a very early startup stage in your organizational evolution, understandably, board members may need to take on more of the actual financial management and operations role, which we didn't talk a lot about, right? Like the actual nuts and bolts, the transactions, the reporting, the policies and controls, the compliance and grants management. Some of that may need to have to be done with boards in a volunteer-run organization. However, as you grow and as you staff up, it's sort of understanding what are the touch points and also the benchmarks for getting the board to a place where they're not doing the operational management. They're there to provide, some level of compliance oversight for sure, as fiduciary agents and with their fiduciary responsibilities, board members, but also really building that capacity for strategic thought partnership, right? I think that's the end game, particularly for organizations that are growing and changing, but understanding depending on where you are in your organizational life cycle, that might not be achievable until you staff up and have additional resources in-house or contracted resources.
Thanks, Dana. And Helena, don't freak out. You're going to be a great treasurer. I will hand this back to presenters. I think it's time for Nancy Bacon, if I'm not mistaken. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I am so delighted to be with you. It's such an honor to spend some time. Now, let's talk about how to turn numbers to action. And so think for a moment, you're a board member. There you are. It's a board meeting. The treasurer starts to talk. You pull out your board packet and you turn to the page that the treasurer seems to be talking about. Oh, man. It all looks like it's a foreign language. Clearly, some people are understanding it because a couple people are talking. Maybe they grew up in a bilingual home. I'm not sure, but I sure don't understand what's going on. You lean over, you're looking closely at the document because we all know we understand numbers better if we put the paper really close to our nose, like things start to make sense. And while you do that, you're looking really closely and you find something you do recognize. There's huevos. I've been to Mexico. I know what huevos are. They are eggs. You gather your courage together and you ask, what about that huevos line item? Why is it so high? A story like this happens in boardrooms any night of the week. Board members pull out a balance sheet and they look at it, and it's in a foreign language. They're expected to know this. And so they're looking at it and maybe they pull out the income statement and there's that photocopy budget. I know what photocopies are. Let's talk about that. Well, it's my job as a nonprofit educator to help board members make sense of what's in front of them. So I have 5 ideas at the intersection of finance and adult learning that I want to share with you today. So our first idea, meet people where they are. Prior knowledge drives future knowledge. What someone knows will determine what they can learn, remember, and use. So not learning styles, those have been debunked. They don't exist. Send me emails if you're grumpy about that. The number one driver of what you can learn is your prior knowledge. So think about the board members coming into your board and what their prior knowledge is. Now, another interesting piece here is that researchers have studied the connection between experts and novices, and they've determined that experts are not fully aware of 70% of their own decisions and mental analyses of tasks. So think about it. You're all expert in something. Think for a moment, what are you expert in? If you were to explain that to somebody who's not expert in that, you are leaving out 70% of the connective tissue that would make it make sense to somebody like me. Okay? And it doesn't mean that our experts are talking less. It's just they're talking in a way that people don't necessarily understand. Okay? So we see this in the boardroom. So when I talk about that connective tissue, I'm talking about business models. I'm talking about historic trends. I'm talking about how different financial statements connect to each other. So just think about that. When you said whoever's driving the finances for your board, whoever that was, it was mostly staff. There is a gap between the experts and the novices in the room. So I have a tip. Know where your people are in their finance knowledge. Invest in that nonprofit finance learning that we've talked about, and adopt a beginner's mind to identify that 70%. That's my first idea. My second idea is focus their attention on what matters. So I recently studied saccades, and that's how our eyes follow certain pathways. So they're those rapid involuntary eye movements that help the brain quickly scan something, and it puts what it is scanning kind of into the brain. Okay, so our eyes follow certain pathways. So look at this picture on the left. We can see where the eyes are going first from eye to eye, then nose to mouth. So it has this kind of cross pathway that it is taking. Eyes tend to do that. So if you've ever been on a train, you know that you're looking at the telephone poles as they go past. Your eyes are drawn to certain things. Well, we can help people know to where to put their eyes. So in our finance training, for example, we teach people to look for 4 things on a balance sheet. You'll be getting a copy of this in the follow-up email, so you don't have to take a picture of it or do anything like that. But we want to tell people where to put their eyes. We want to train board members to always look for these things so they start to have the habit of looking for them. They start to build up their confidence in where those things are. So I have a tip. Tell people what to look for in your financial documents. And the great news is Peter has a hack for this. So as soon as I'm done, you're going to hear more strategies on how to do this. But rather than giving people a sheet full of numbers, tell them what to look for and where they should direct their eyes. My next idea is to give them a chance to make meaning from the numbers. Stories create meaning. So stories have been around for millennia, and they allow us to take information and turn it into something that has context. Okay, so they allowed us to understand the world and ourselves better. So one of my favorite activities when I teach finance is our once upon a time story. So I give everyone an income statement, the same one you're going to get in your email box. And I invite participants to settle into the numbers and to pull out a bedtime story for a child or a friend. So I'll tell you, I've been doing this for many years. There's often ogres, dragons, princesses, you know, talking frogs. We've had, in a native context, we had the aunties who gathered and created a museum. It gets very creative, which I want to underscore is taking numbers and putting it into something that many people might better relate to. There's only one rule in this game. The story must be anchored in the numbers. So if you say something is growing or doing badly or a moral problem for some reason, you must tell us how the numbers back that up. Now, why do I do this? I do love stories, but I do it for 3 reasons. First of all, I can test that they understand the numbers. It's a quick, just do they get it? Second, I can understand if they understand the business model behind the numbers. So when we talk about, you know, the funding streams, or we talk about all the business model stuff that we talked about just a few minutes ago, I can see if they understand kind of what's under the hood of this organization. Thirdly, I can get at the myths and stories that they're holding on, maybe not talking about, but is kind of under the surface, right? So, I mean, you think about all the kind of biases we have about finance. You know, what princess story doesn't end up talking about overhead and pay equity, right? What a great way to open up these conversations. And so what I often tell boards who come to my training is, do it with my income statement. You have no emotional attachment to mine. And then do it with yours, with which you do have some sort of an emotional attachment. Okay, so transfer the skill building that you get back to your own organization. That's my third idea. My fourth idea is to make it social. You may have heard about social proof. Well, social connection is vital, 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 vital when it comes to learning. So adults learn best when they can engage with others. So sharing experiences, solving real problems together, right? It deepens understanding, builds confidence. Think about all the study groups or buddy programs, mentoring groups, cohorts you've been a part of, right? Social connection is absolutely vital. So in my experience, finance conversations most often happen in a full group context. So that's one to all. I talk, you all listen. Treasurer talks, the whole board listens. And you have to build up that courage if you actually want to talk. Okay? So how do we get more voices in the conversation? How do we hear the people who don't feel as confident? How do we hear people who are maybe speaking this language for the first time? And I want to suggest you try pair share in small group conversations. We do it all the time in trainings. Why not do it in the boardroom when you are adopting kind of a training mindset? Okay, so what are you going to be talking about in these pair shares and small groups? Well, take some scenarios. Do some storytelling. Do my activity I just gave you. Talk about some of these strategic questions. You know, what you just learned from Hilda would be a great small group conversation, and then bring it to the big group. Okay, so the more you can break it down, the more you get people lifting their voices into the conversation. Finally, tap into their emotions. Emotions are at the root of action. We all have a money story around which we have an emotional connection. So when I teach finance, I often hear about childhood poverty. I hear about money held in power over someone. I hear about experiences living paycheck to paycheck. People have strong emotions connected to money. I also hear joyful stories. I also hear about, you know, earning my first money to buy a car or go to college. We hear about the, you know, the dollar that is taped up to the wall over the cashier, so proud that our small business is finally raising money, bringing in money. Emotions have a strong connection to money, and the more we can tap into that, the more powerful we can be. So I often ask board members, what's your money story? And my second question is, what is the money story your mission needs from you right now? BJ Fogg, the author of Tiny Habits, The Small Changes That Change Everything, writes, emotions create habits, not repetition, not frequency, not even my fairy dust. Emotions. So my tip for you is to talk about board members' money stories. Anchor in why something matters, because that's a heart connection, and help each person to know their role. Try out these 5 ideas. Let me know how they go. I'd really love to hear from you. I'm grateful for this chance to be with you all today.
Nancy, thank you very much for your presentation, and good afternoon, everyone. Nancy just shared with us some of the things, 5 points that we can consider when communicating and preparing financial information for our boards. And in my presentation, I'll share some information with you about how you might go about this, and I hope what I present will be useful to you in your leadership practice. We'll go to the next slide. So typically, you know, when we're presenting financial information to the board, we're providing them with the income statement, and then the next slide, the balance sheet. You know, now we've covered this point already today. I'm going to reinforce it. You know, many times our board members are unfamiliar with the financial statements. Which statement is which? What do these statements even say? Sometimes board members are not particularly interested in the financial report, or they may defer to the treasurer. You know, if the treasurer's okay with the finances, then so am I. That might be the train of thought for some of our board members. However, each board member has a fiduciary responsibility to the organization as part of their board service. And it is our job as leaders to increase their ability to engage with the financial statements and the financial reports being delivered. So I have a board hack to share with you, which you may find useful. We're going to go to the next slide. And as Nancy pointed out, you don't need to worry about trying to read all of these. My presentation is going to come to you in a PDF document with kind of a narrative preamble talking about it. So in my nonprofit career, I spent more than 20 years in a nonprofit that served the mission of organ donation for transplantation. And I recall the first year that I prepared a budget for the board, and the board consisted primarily of transplant surgeons. I put my materials together and I reached the final conclusion on the last page, page 20. So when I was presenting this to my CEO at the time, she, went through the report. She set it down on her desk and she told me, they're never going to read as far as your conclusion. And in that moment, she taught me a really valuable lesson. And it is the importance of the executive summary. So what I've done, this is the same income statement that you saw a couple of slides ago. What I have done is to begin the portrayal of the financial statements with a concise paragraph that tells the entirety of the story, all the salient points about what these financial statements are conveying to us for this period of time. In this case, the organization has a X% surplus representing how many dollars compared to the budget of, another percentage, et cetera. The percentage of funds associated with government sources, et cetera. The important idea here is to be able to have your board member walk into the room. They may not have read your carefully prepared materials in advance, to have them feel like they understand the story right from the get-go, from the financials. Now, if you look at the income statement as it's presented here, it's the same statement as the previous one, except in this case, the columns are numbered and lettered and the rows are numbered. So now imagine being able to report to the board and keep them on the most important points by being able to direct their attention. Let's look at column C, row 4, and we're going to talk about fundraising events, coming in over budget or whatever. If you scan your eye on this income statement all over the way over to the right-hand column, the light green column, you're going to see a number of note references. And so for any line item that I, as the financial leader or the reporter, I might be the board treasurer, I might be the executive director, what I want to draw their attention to, I'm going to create a note for. So hang on to the thought of notes, and we're going to get to them in just a second. And we'll go to the next slide. And you can see in this slide, it's the balance sheet reformatted in a similar way, lettering the columns and numbering the rows, and then making references to notes. Let's go to the next slide. So on this slide, there's two thoughts going on. On the left-hand side, you can see the notes section. So note number 1 came from the income statement, and I'm going to make some statement here regarding the variance or regarding some factor going on related to, in this case, it's a revenue line item. And you can go all the way through for all of your key variances and make statements that will help the board member stay on track with you. On the right-hand side of this slide, I also included some key ratios. So results from the prior period and the current period, and then, pulling out some of the, the key ratios that I wanted to highlight. In the comments section, I included the definition of the ratio to help the board member understand, okay, now what's the current ratio again? I forgot from last month. Oh, the definition is right here in the notes to help reinforce learning. So we talked earlier about who has the financial leadership role in your organization. If you adopt a methodology, annotating your financial statements, including an executive summary, if you choose to adopt a methodology such as this, you're also going to need to make the determination as to who is best positioned in your organization to actually accomplish this. Once you've determined that and you've tested out an approach, you can then gauge whether this approach and a presentation using annotated financial statements has actually increased the engagement of your board members in the financial life of the organization. You know, we need to keep in mind that our board members are busy people, and they are attracted to our mission primarily because of the mission, you know, not necessarily the finances or the other workings of the organization. But by presenting information in this format, you might assist your members in understanding the implications of the financial results and help keep them on track with where you are as you are delivering your presentation. In the narrative style, they can reference this, you know, before the meeting, during the meeting, after the meeting, and through the executive summary, you can educate them on the key financial points in a rapid and succinct manner. So earlier today, at the beginning of our session, Nancy Frigo talked to us about the specific financial concerns and considerations for her own organization. Hilda talked about ways to think about key risk areas to consider. Nancy Bacon presented on how to more effectively communicate with and engage the board. And the board hack I just presented, you know, requires an examination of your organization's financial life. You know, what are you and your board currently facing from a financial lens? So now perhaps you could take a moment and enter into the chat, you know, what are some of the metrics that are most important for your organization to measure and monitor? What are some of your tips and tricks that you use to engage the board? Thanks a lot for your time.
Thanks, Peter. I think we're going to bring everybody back for our final Q&A before we wrap things up. Nancy, you got a lot of great responses. They're begging for more in the chat. They're clearly interested. Several folks actually asked you, and you did respond there as well about financial storytelling, which is so important. But any other directions folks can go in terms of, I don't know, further reading or additional types of examples they could think of in this area?
Wade, if
I
I
think
could,
it's so- Go ahead.
sorry, if I could jump in. Nancy, you talked about people bring in their knowledge, their prior understanding. One of the suggestions I would have for new board members as part of board orientation is to show maybe a 3 or 4 year historical view of the key performance indicators for the organization, what's happened to revenue, expenses, what are our reserves. So walking in, they have a history of, it's like they're walking into a movie that's been going on for some time. And through the quarterly board meetings, revisiting those KPIs that they were introduced to when they first joined the board and continuing to revisit them. Sometimes if you've been on a board 3 or 4 years, you assume everyone else knows what you know. That may not be the case. So I really appreciate it, Nancy, your sort of, you bring what you know.
Absolutely. Well, and I think, you know, what I invite people to do is step out of the subject matter we're talking about. So if I teach a board class, I'm like, step out of the board and finance, step out of finance. Think about the people in front of you are people. They're people. They have knowledge, they have emotions, they have, you know, all sorts of things. And so speak first to them as people. And there's so much from adult learning, behavioral science, and all of that. That's what I spend my time studying. So much of that we can draw on to move people to action. And so how do we talk about motivation? How do we talk, like, you know, the perennial question, I can't get my board to look at the board materials. Well, there are strategies around that. There are strategies related to kind of adult learning and behavioral science that we can draw from. So I want to talk a little bit about the story and my response to Mary, and that is we all have stories that we want to be telling, right? We all have stories that we want our board to be kind of protagonists in. So think as a storyteller, go back to high school English and think about that story arc that we all learned with Odysseus or whoever you studied, Harry Potter, whatever, and think about the stories you want your board members to be kind of be in either as lead characters or not. And those are the stories that I would start with.
Can I say something about our board development that's also beneficial? Is we have our directors of each of our program, including myself, every other month, we do like a 10-minute presentation, and we rotate it every year so that new board members are like exposed to it. Old board members have a refresher. So mine's actually coming up next month. And that's actually one of the things I talk about, because my budget will be done. And we will talk about that and what metrics they want to see. If this new dashboard that I started like last July, has this been working? Would you like a tweak? And that's something we all do. And that helps to find out what they want to see, because as your board kind of changes, sometimes the metrics of what they want to see change. But I think it's important to figure out, get their input, but also let them know if there's a restriction on that, like we were saying, what's actually something the staff can do that's not too much.
And Nancy, for Joe, Lisa put in the chat, explaining cash flow has been a challenge for me. Could use some help with that one. And it's a challenge for everyone because it's hard to get folks to be able to grasp it. And often we put it in something that's a fairly complicated presentation. I know that's kind of your biggest, thought is cash flow. How simplified is your reporting to the board on that? Is it part of your dashboard, or do you have a separate cash flow statement or projection that you're presenting?
Well, internally, I have, the big ugly spreadsheet.
Yeah, right.
So I can figure out things like, okay, this is what we're going to owe for each payroll. This is what we're going to owe for the rents. And so like the big players, get them in there, and it lets me like work with it real time. So I know that if this month's ICASA reimbursement is $80,000, I can put it in for tentatively 45 days out and think, okay, I'll be getting my money back. Now, what the board actually gets is a 30, 60, and 90-day projection based on that big ugly spreadsheet.
Right.
With income and expense and where we expect to have like what we think would be in the bank account. And I tell them by the time we get to 90 days, it might be getting to fantasy land, but they can at least see with comparison by the income and the expenses, they get an idea of what's going on, and it's not completely foreign to them, even though they may not know the minutia, which is, trust me, if they, like you said, if they saw minutia, their eyes would glaze over and it'd go right over their head.
I know that look very well.
And one of my favorite ways to teach cash flow is to invite people to think about their own cash flow. So think about your own cash flow as a family or as a person. And so, I have these graphics, like kind of a family might have kind of a set amount of money coming in every month from a salary, but they spend a lot in the holidays and a lot in the summertime. And so let's get to know our own cash flow. And then we just kind of, again, start with prior knowledge. They all know that. And then let's lay over what we need them to know about nonprofits.
I do think it's important because, Nancy's particular business model really is highly dependent on cash flow. That's the kind of business model it is. There would be another business model, say if you were dependent on individual donations, you might want to keep an eye on how many of those donors were new donors, how many were old donors, and how many were large versus small donors. Those are incredibly important things to keep in touch with if you have that kind of business model. And for each one of the business models, you're going to be looking at different metrics. And I do feel like, making sure, one of the things that is true about boards is that board members do not enjoy feeling like they're losing face in front of their colleagues. That is not something they enjoy. The more you can lay a common grounding for people about what's important. Okay, this month I want to tell you, this is where we are with the large versus small donors. We've made real headway. This is the reason why it matters so much. Just doing that brings everybody back into the room in a place where they can have a conversation. Rather than just kind of doing any kind of shorthand or whatever, it's just a matter of reminding people, this is why it matters, this is why it matters, this is why it matters, this is what you need to focus on in this particular thing. But leaving enough room for side kind of observations, so that you're not setting the whole agenda, because God forbid we should, any of us, be responsible for such stuff.
Peter, there was a question I've seen as well. We have talked about in the past. You know, these internal presentations or reports that we do, they really are ours to develop and ours to essentially refine over time. But there's also the risk of them being a little too dynamic in the sense of tweaking them and changing them. How do you kind of hold the line on that in terms of not changing them too much over time? Because I know as board members change, revolve in and out, they want to see different aspects of the numbers.
Agreed, you know, and I think that there is a tendency on boards to constantly want to refine and change it next month and the next month and the next month. It would be great, you know, if you have a board treasurer or an ally on the board from a financial perspective to agree on a format and agree to a timetable of saying, we're going to live with this for 12 months and we're going to learn from this document for an extended period of time. And then, you know, maybe we are informed and we make alterations. We're not going to reinforce learning by always changing how we are doing this. The repeatability and the cadence of the presentation is really key, I think, to help people begin to expect what they're going to hear and in what order they're going to hear it, and kind of reinforce learning. You know, so I would try to hold the line at, okay, we agreed to this. We're going to do this for a while.
Yeah, we only have changes once a year at the most. I think since I've started my dashboard, I've changed one metric.
That's right. Keep it consistent. Well, I think that's our time now. It's 3:29, so I think at this point I'm meant to hand this over to Amanda. Thank you.
Or to me.
Oh, to Ruth. You're on.
All right, I want to remind people that you are going to get a bunch of original material at the end of this webinar, where we've actually been privileged enough to have an original article or tool from Peter, who's going to share his board hack with you, from Nancy, Nancy Bacon, who will share her kind of 5 core thoughts, and from Hilda. And I want to talk about Hilda's piece because that is an excellent focusing piece that we really encourage people to use and to share. We're going to send you the original copy of the article that they've written around that piece at the end of this webinar, and we really encourage you to redistribute it everywhere so that people can get their boards into those conversations at the level that they need to be at right now. Finally, I just want to thank, this was an excellent bunch of presentations, and I want to encourage people, please let us know what you need to hear about. Remember, we're going to be doing a course for board members on how to think about finances. So keep an eye out for that. That's going to be very exciting. It'll be the first time that we've done that. And finally, don't forget, we actually need your support financially. And even if you can only send us $5, if you can send us 100, if you can send us 1,000, go ahead and do it, because we need your support in order to keep doing these webinars. Thank you, everybody who gave us your time today, and thank everybody who came in and participated on the chat, and we will see you soon. Bye.